She could not read. She could not write. She had never trained with a sword, never drilled with soldiers, never studied a military map, or attended a war council. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a tenant farmer in a village called Normandy, so remote that most of France would not have been able to find it on a map, and most of France did not own maps. Her hands were calloused from fieldwork, not from gripping lances. Her body was slight, built for labor, not for combat. She had never left her province until the year she walked out of it and changed the course of European history. In the spring of 1429, this girl stood before the besieged gates of Orleans, the last major city in France that had not fallen to England, wearing armor borrowed from the treasury of a king who barely believed she was real, commanding soldiers twice her age who had spent years learning how to retreat in an organized fashion. The English army surrounding Orleans was not just large, it was the inheritor of a legacy that had broken France for 92 years. These were the soldiers of Agincourt's legend, the conquerors of Normandy, the inheritors of a military tradition that had reduced the French crown, nothing left to crown him over. And this girl, this peasant girl who heard voices, had come to save him. The paradox was so extreme that the men around her processed it in two ways. Some believed she was sent by God. Some believed she was sent by the devil. Almost none of them believed she was simply a human being who had decided, with absolute totality, to do what no one else had managed to do. What happened next at Orleans is one of the most documented, most witnessed, most argued over military episodes of the entire medieval period. The chronicles are extensive, the testimonies survive, the facts are not in dispute, and the facts are impossible. To understand why what Joan of Arc accomplished was not just extraordinary, but structurally impossible within every established framework of medieval military logic, you have to understand what France had become by 1429. Not just politically, not just militarily, psychologically, spiritually, what it meant to be a French soldier in the early 15th century, what that word had come to carry, what the banner of France had come to represent after 92 years of progressive, documented, humiliating failure. The 100 Years' War had not been a war for 100 years. It had been a slow catastrophe that lasted 100 years. It began in 1337, when Edward III of England asserted a claim to the French throne that France considered illegitimate and England considered self-evident. What followed was not a single sustained conflict, but a series of campaigns, truces, treaties, betrayals, plagues, and renaissances of violence that consumed multiple generations on both sides. But within that century of intermittent war, there had been moments that calcified French military psychology into something brittle and defeated. The Battle of Crécy in 1346, the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. The Black Death took roughly a third of the French population and left the survivors in a world of collapsed institutions and delegitimized authority. And then, worst of all, the thing that every French soldier of 1429 carried in his chest like a wound that would not close, Agincourt. October 25, 1415, Henry V of England crossed the Channel with an army of roughly 12,000 men, some historians say fewer, exhausted, disease-ridden, depleted by weeks of campaigning, desperate to reach Calais before the French could cut them off. The French army that intercepted them at Agincourt numbered somewhere between 12,000 and 36,000, depending on which chronicle you trust. Even the most conservative estimates place the French force at a ratio of at least 3 French soldiers for every 1 Englishman. Some contemporary accounts suggest 6 to 1. The result was the most psychologically devastating defeat in French military history. In a single afternoon, Henry V destroyed a force that should have destroyed him. French casualties numbered in the thousands, including the cream of the French nobility, the lords and dukes and counts who formed the backbone of French political and military identity. English casualties, perhaps a few hundred. The numbers vary, but the disproportion is not in dispute. Agincourt did not just cost France an army, it cost France its self-conception. The English longbow, which had already proven its dominance at Crécy and Poitiers, demonstrated once again with mathematical clarity that the French model of war was structurally broken. French heavy cavalry, the pride of chivalric tradition, charged across muddy fields into a wall of arrows, collapsing in on itself, knights trampling knights in the press of panic. The chronicler Jean de Wavrin described French noblemen so packed together by the narrow battlefield that they could not raise their arms.
They stood shoulder to shoulder and died in place, while English archers, stationed behind wooden stakes, shot them from fixed positions until the field was carpeted with armored men drowning in mud. The trauma of Agincourt was not just tactical.
It was existential. The French military system, the cultural logic of how France made war, what it meant to be a French knight, the entire chivalric mythology that justified the aristocratic class had been exposed as suicidal. And the men who survived carried that knowledge home with them. By 1429, France was not losing the 100 Years' War. France had lost it. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 had officially recognized Henry V as heir to the French throne. King Charles VI of France, the man known to history as Charles the Mad, who had suffered from debilitating mental illness for decades, had disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles, in the treaty's terms. When Charles VI died in 1422 and Henry V died the same year, it was Henry's infant son, Henry VI of England, who was formally crowned King of France in Paris in 1431. The Dauphin, the man Joan of Arc was fighting to crown, was not simply an uncrowned king. He was legally, under the most powerful treaty in French history, a bastard. His own mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, had signed documents suggesting he was not legitimately the son of Charles VI. His claim to the throne was contested not just by English arms, but by French law and French royal documents. He had retreated to the Loire Valley with the remnant of his court and a shrinking circle of loyal territories. His army was a skeleton. His treasury was empty. The English, commanded by the Duke of Bedford, acting as regent for the infant Henry VI, controlled Paris, controlled Normandy, controlled most of northern France, and in October 1428 had sent an army south to besiege Orleans, the last significant city on the Loire, the gateway to everything the Dauphin still held. If Orleans fell, the war was over. Not metaphorically, literally. The military assessors who studied the situation in late 1428 and early 1429 concluded, in documents that survive, that the loss of Orleans would mean the loss of everything south of the Loire. The Dauphin would be left with nothing worth defending. The English union of the two crowns would become a fait accompli. The English besieging force at Orleans numbered approximately 5,000 soldiers. They had established a ring of fortified earthwork positions called bastilles, surrounding the city on most sides. The city garrison and population were holding out, but supplies were running short, morale was declining, and multiple relief attempts had failed. The most recent relief attempt, in February 1429, ended in the episode known as the Battle of the Herrings, a bizarre and humiliating engagement in which a French force attacked an English supply convoy and was routed, the convoy consisting largely of salted fish being transported for Lenten consumption. The French military had just been defeated by a cartload of herring. The chroniclers recorded it. The soldiers remembered it. This was the France that Joan of Arc walked into when she left Domremy in January 1429 at the age of 17, possibly 16, the exact birth date is uncertain, and traveled through English-held territory to reach the Dauphin's court at Chinon. She had been trying to get to the Dauphin for a year. She first appeared at a local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, in the spring of 1428, and told him she had been sent by God to lift the siege of Orleans and bring the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. Baudricourt told her to go home. She came back in January 1429. This time, something in her manner, her certainty, her persistence, something the chroniclers struggled to name precisely, persuaded him to give her an escort. The journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon took 11 days through hostile territory in the middle of winter. Joan traveled in male clothing to avoid attention. She arrived at the Dauphin's court in late February or early March 1429,
and what happened there is both documented and contested. The Dauphin, according to multiple accounts, attempted to test her. He disguised himself among his courtiers, placed another man on the throne, and waited to see what she would do.
She walked past the decoy, identified the Dauphin in the crowd, and knelt before him. Whether this was genuinely miraculous or whether someone had briefed her, the debate has not been resolved in 600 years, and probably cannot be. The effect on the assembled court was immediate and significant. She told him things. What exactly she told him is recorded in fragments, in testimony given decades later at her rehabilitation trial. She apparently told him that he was the legitimate heir to the throne of France, that he was not a bastard, that God recognized his claim. For a man whose own mother had signed documents suggesting his illegitimacy, who had been formally disinherited by treaty, and who was surrounded by a court riddled with defeatists and English partisans, this was not merely a theological statement.
It was a political declaration so precise and so personally targeted that it either proved she had supernatural knowledge or proved she had access to intelligence networks whose sophistication was entirely inconsistent with a peasant girl from Domremy.
The Dauphin did not immediately believe her.
He subjected her to 3 weeks of theological examination by the doctors of the University of Poitiers, who questioned her, examined her, and ultimately returned a verdict that she appeared sincere, that nothing in her claims was contrary to Catholic doctrine, and that, given the desperate state of France, the Dauphin might as well try. She was given armor. She was given a horse. She was given a staff that included squires, pages, and a household chaplain. She was given, crucially, a banner, white and gold, bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, which she carried in battle in preference to a weapon, because she said she did not want to kill anyone.
The banner itself became, in contemporary accounts, a military object of the highest psychological significance. Where the banner went, the charge followed. She was not given command. That is important to understand. The military command of the relief force sent to Orleans was formerly held by Jean de Dunois, known as the Bastard of Orleans, an illegitimate son of a previous Duke of Orleans who had been defending the city and was now part of the relief operation. He was an experienced, competent, battle-tested commander. He was also, by his own later testimony, completely unprepared for what Joan of Arc represented. The force that finally entered Orleans on April 29, 1429, numbered approximately 4,000 soldiers, reinforcements and supplies, supplemented by the existing garrison. They faced roughly 5,000 English soldiers in fortified positions that had been constructed and improved over 6 months. Military logic, applied to these numbers with the standard medieval calculus of fortified position defense, said this was not a contest the French could win quickly, if at all.
Standard siege relief doctrine called for a supply replenishment, negotiated probing, gradual erosion of the besieging forces' morale through attrition, and waiting for English supply lines to fail.
Joan of Arc rejected this doctrine before she had been in Orleans for 48 hours. The professional soldiers around her tried to manage her. Dunois and his captains held council meetings that they did not invite her to, made plans they did not share with her, and attempted to conduct the relief operation using the established methods that had failed to work for 6 months.
She found out about these councils. She confronted Dunois directly. The testimony from Dunois himself, given at her rehabilitation trial 25 years after her death, is remarkable in its honesty. He does not describe her as being commanded. He describes her as commanding, by force of something he cannot name, by a certainty so absolute that it made experienced soldiers feel, in his words, that she knew things they did not know.
She told them they would take the English Bastilles. Not try, not attempt. They would take them, one by one. She told them the dates. She told them which ones were first. She was wrong about one date. She predicted an assault for a particular morning that Dunois delayed until the afternoon without her knowledge, and when she found out, she was furious. But she was not wrong about the outcome. What happened between May 4 and May 7, 1429, in the fields and earthworks outside Orleans, has been studied by military historians for centuries.
The chronology is documented in multiple independent sources. The basic facts are not in dispute. The interpretation of those facts remains permanently open.
On May 4th, the French attacked and took the English Bastille of St. Louis. Joan was present in the assault, carrying her banner, not fighting with a weapon.
Contemporaries record that she moved through combat with a focused lack of fear that they described as supernatural. Not invincible, not armored against harm, but simply unaffected by the psychological logic that fear imposes on a body in danger. She was wounded before the campaign was over. But on May 4, she was everywhere, forward, in the press of the fighting, and the English positions fell. On May 5th, a day of rest, imposed by Joan, who observed the Feast of the Ascension and refused to fight.
On May 6th, the French took the English bastilles on the south bank of the Loire, including the fortified Augustinian convent. The assault was not supposed to happen. Joan launched it against the advice of the captains. It succeeded. And then, May 7, the assault on the Tourelles, the most heavily fortified English position, the bridgehead fortress at the south end of the main bridge across the Loire, the key to the entire English siege system.
If the Tourelles fell, the English ring was broken. If the Tourelles held, the French losses in the previous days would have bought nothing. The assault began in the early morning. It continued for most of the day.
It was brutal, and it was failing. The English defenders in the Tourelles, commanded by Sir William Glasdale, a veteran English knight, were fighting effectively from prepared positions. French soldiers were dying on the approaches. The ladders were being thrown back. By midday, many of the captains were ready to withdraw for the day and resume the next morning. Joan had been wounded. An English crossbow bolt had struck her above the collarbone, penetrating several inches into her shoulder.
By the accounts of multiple witnesses, she withdrew briefly from the assault, removed the bolt herself, or with minimal help, wept briefly, confessed to her chaplain, and returned to the battle. She had been warned the wound might be mortal if she pushed too hard. She returned to the assault anyway.
What happened next is described in the testimony of soldiers who were present, recorded in the rehabilitation trial. Joan took her banner, the white and gold banner with the names of Jesus and Mary, and placed it against the wall of the Tourelles.
She held it there. The standard was visible from the entire battlefield, and the French assault, which had been failing, reorganized and surged. Dunois himself later said he gave the order to withdraw that afternoon, and then saw Joan's banner at the wall and countermanded it.
He said he had never been more glad to countermand an order. The Tourelles fell as the sun went down on May 7, 1429. William Glasdale, the English commander, fell into the Loire and drowned in his armor.
His body was never recovered. On the morning of May 8th, the English commanders, Thomas Scales, John Talbot, the Duke of Suffolk, drew up their remaining forces outside Orleans and offered battle in the open field. By every calculation of military logic, this was a rational offer. The French force had taken serious casualties over the previous days. The English force, though reduced, was still capable of fighting. An open field engagement might yet reverse the situation. Joan rode out to meet them. The French army deployed behind her. Then she ordered, against the advice of the captains, against the logic of the military moment, against everything a rational professional soldier would have told her, she ordered the French army not to attack.
It was Sunday. She would not fight on Sunday. The English waited. The French held their formation and did not advance.
For an extraordinary period of time, the accounts vary in duration, but all agree it happened, the two armies faced each other across a field outside Orleans in the early morning light, and nothing happened, because a 17-year-old girl with a crossbow wound in her shoulder and a theological objection to Sunday combat had told her soldiers to stand still. Then the English turned around and marched away.
The siege of Orleans was lifted. In 9 days of active combat, using a force numerically smaller than the besieging army, Joan of Arc and the French relief force dismantled a siege that had been in place for 6 months and had been assessed by every competent military observer as essentially unbreakable. The English response to this event is, in its own way, as revealing as the French triumph. The senior English commanders, men who had spent careers mastering the mechanics of medieval warfare, who had fought at Agincourt and in the Norman campaigns, who understood the material realities of soldiers, fortifications, and supply lines, reported to the Duke of Bedford in terms that sounded, coming from these men, almost hallucinatory. They reported that their soldiers would not fight her. Not could not, in a tactical sense, would not. That something about her presence, the banner, the certainty, the wound she had taken and walked back from, the physical fact of her being what she was in the places she was, had produced in the English soldiers a fear that operated below rational military calculation. She had been described in intelligence reports sent to Bedford as a creature of the enemy camp who used witchcraft and sorcery to demoralize English forces. Bedford himself, in a letter to the English council, acknowledged that a disciple and limb of the fiend, called the Pucelle, who used false enchantments and sorcery, had destroyed the English position at Orleans. This is the English regent, the most powerful administrator in France, the man who governed France in the name of the infant Henry VI, writing in official correspondence that he could not explain what had happened at Orleans except by recourse to the supernatural. He was not being metaphorical, he was being precise.
What had happened at Orleans did not fit inside the military framework he possessed. He had no other category for it. The Loire campaign that followed Orleans was even more extraordinary in its tempo. Between June 11 and June 18, 1429, Joan led or was present at the battles of Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, Beaugency, and Pétain, 4 engagements in 8 days that shattered English military power in the Loire Valley and captured some of England's most senior commanders, including John Talbot, who had been considered one of the most formidable English military figures of the age.
The Battle of Patay on June 18th is worth pausing on. The English had deployed in the classic defensive formation that had worked at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, longbowmen taking covered positions, infantry behind, waiting for the French cavalry to charge into the arrows. The French advance guard moved too fast.
The English archers had not finished hammering their defensive stakes into the ground when French cavalry hit their position. The English line collapsed almost immediately. Talbot was captured. The English force at Patay was largely destroyed. French casualties were minimal. The chronicles report fewer than 100 dead, against English losses in the thousands.
Patay was Agincourt in reverse. The same armies, the same weapons, the same tactical logic, and the result was inverted, because the French came forward before the English archers were ready, and the English archers were not ready because the French were moving with a speed and aggression that had been entirely absent from French military behavior for a generation. Speed and aggression. Those were Joan's military contributions, not tactical innovation in the technical sense.
Not new weapons or new formations. She attacked. She attacked quickly. She attacked before councils could meet, debts could be tallied, and fears could be formalized into caution. The professional soldiers around her, men of genuine competence and long experience, had been trained by 92 years of French military culture into a posture of defensive hesitation.
She had not been trained by anything except voices she heard in a garden in Domremy, and those voices apparently never counseled hesitation. The coronation of Charles VII at Reims on July 17, 1429, completed the first phase of what Joan had said she would do. She was present, standing near the altar, holding her banner.
She had told the Dauphin, when she first arrived at his court, that she would bring him to Reims and crown him. The road to Reims passed through English-held territory. The military and political advisors had told him it was impossible. She brought him to Reims. The bishop anointed him with the sacred oil.
The man who had been called the Dauphin became Charles VII, King of France, by a ceremony whose legitimacy was unimpeachable, because it was performed in the correct cathedral with the correct oil and the correct ritual that had consecrated French kings for centuries. The English had controlled Paris. They had controlled northern France. They had controlled the French throne by treaty. They had not controlled Reims, and they had not controlled the coronation, and now they could not undo it. Henry VI could be called King of France in London.
But Charles VII had been anointed at Reims, and in the theological and political logic of medieval France, that was the only ceremony that actually made a king. Joan wept at the coronation. Multiple witnesses recorded it.
She had told people she did not expect to survive long, that her voices had not promised her a long life, only that she would accomplish what she had been sent to accomplish. She had accomplished it. She was 17 years old, going on 18. She had been in active campaigning for less than 3 months. What followed was tragedy, and the tragedy has its own instruction. The king she had crowned, Charles VII, was not a decisive man. He had survived 20 years of political instability, disinheritance, and military humiliation by being extremely cautious, extremely suspicious, and extremely reluctant to commit resources to any position that might be reversed. He was not a fool. He was, in many respects, a gifted political tactician who would eventually drive the English out of France almost entirely. But he was not the kind of man who pressed advantages quickly.
Joan pressed her advantages with speed. That was what she knew how to do. That was who she was.
After the coronation, she wanted to attack Paris immediately, while the English and their Burgundian allies were still reeling from the Loire campaign, still processing the coronation, still uncertain of their positions. The military momentum was French. The psychological tide had turned. This was the moment. Charles hesitated. He negotiated. He entered into a truce with the Duke of Burgundy, the most powerful French lord who had allied with the English, that Joan considered a betrayal of everything the campaign had achieved. She was not present at those negotiations. She was not consulted. She was, increasingly, an inconvenience to a court that had gotten what it needed from her and now found her certainty and her impatience difficult to manage.
The attack on Paris in September 1429 was launched without full royal support, with insufficient forces, at a moment determined not by military logic, but by political compromise. It failed. Joan was wounded again, an arrow through the thigh. She was pulled from the field against her will. The assault was abandoned. The voices had not told her Paris would fall in September 1429.
But she attacked anyway, because she knew, with the same certainty that had governed every decision of her entire campaign, that hesitation was the enemy. The winter of 1429 to 1430 saw the campaign fragment. Smaller engagements, indecisive outcomes, the grinding reversion of military momentum that happens when political will retreats.
In May 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces at Compiègne while commanding the rearguard of a retreat. She was sold to the English. Charles VII did not ransom her. There is no evidence he tried. The trial at Rouen lasted from January to May 1431. It was conducted by Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, an English partisan who had a financial and political stake in her condemnation. The charge was heresy.
The specific claim was that her wearing male clothing and her assertion that her voices came from God rather than from demonic sources constituted heresy and obstinacy that required the death penalty. The trial records survive in extraordinary detail. They run to hundreds of pages of questions, answers, cross-examinations, and procedural records. Joan, uneducated, alone, without counsel, without access to friendly advisors, under constant pressure from dozens of trained theologians and lawyers, gave answers that the scholars who have studied the records for centuries describe as remarkable.
She parried questions. She turned logic back on her interrogators. She declined to answer things that might trap her and answered things that might exonerate her with precision.
For an illiterate girl of 19 with no legal training, she appears to have understood the shape of the trap she was in and done what she could to find the exits from it. There were no exits.
The verdict was predetermined. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned alive in the old market square of Rouen. She was 19 years old. She asked for a cross to be held before her eyes. An English soldier made her a small cross from 2 pieces of wood. She held it against her chest until the flames made her release it. The crowds at the execution were large. Multiple witnesses later testified that they wept, including, according to some accounts, English soldiers who had come to watch. The executioner testified afterward that he was afraid his soul was damned for what he had done. The cardinal who presided over the execution said, according to the Chronicle, "We are ruined. We have burned a saint." She had been dead for 20 years when the rehabilitation trial finally opened.
Charles VII, by then securely established as king, commissioned a review of the original conviction.
The conclusion of the Rehabilitation Tribunal, delivered in 1456, was that the trial of 1431 had been corrupt, the conviction void, and Joan of Arc innocent of all charges. 25 years after they burned her, the same church that had condemned her declared the condemnation fraudulent.
She was canonized in 1920. It took that long for an institution to catch up to what several 100,000 French people had understood on the morning of May 8, 1429, when the English army turned around and marched away from Orleans.
What do we do with Joan of Arc? What category holds her? The military historians catalog her campaigns with precision. The Loire Valley in 58 days, 4 major engagements. The siege lifted in 9 days of active combat against superior fortified positions. The coronation succeeded against every political and military calculation. They apply the mathematics, and the mathematics work out the same way every time. The numbers should have produced a different outcome. The theologians have their category and have had it since 1920. The psychologists have offered several competing frameworks, some respectful, some reductive, and most inadequate to the data.
Political historians note, correctly, that she arrived at the precise moment when French national identity was crystallizing around the question of whether France would be French or English, and that she embodied that question in a form simple enough for every soldier in her army to understand, without requiring literacy or political education. All of these frameworks capture something. None of them is sufficient.
What the evidence actually shows is a human being who had removed from herself the biological constraint that governs almost all human decision-making, the survival instinct. Not through madness, not through delusion, not through an absence of understanding the danger. The wound above her collarbone on May 7th, the arrow through her thigh in September. These were her body's unambiguous messages about the nature of combat, and she received them and returned to the field anyway.
She understood that her body might die. She had apparently accepted that outcome before she left Normandy.
And the acceptance of that outcome freed her from the calculation that prevented every other French commander from pressing forward when pressing forward was dangerous. The professional soldiers around her were not cowards. They were rationally constrained by the reality of their own mortality.
Joan was not irrational. She was rational within a framework where death was an acceptable variable rather than the terminal one. And within that framework, her tactical conclusions were consistently correct. Attack. Attack quickly. Attack before the enemy can prepare. Attack before your own counsel can deliberate you into hesitation.
Hold the banner at the wall until the men watching it decide that the wall can be taken. This is not a story about miracles, though she believed in them. It is not a story about divine intervention, though she claimed it.
It is a story about what becomes possible for an army when one person in it has genuinely stopped being afraid of death, and what that liberation from fear transmits like contagion to the people who witness it.
The English soldiers at Orleans were not defeated by a supernatural enemy. They were defeated by the encounter with a human being who was operating outside the rules of mortality that they were operating inside.
They had no military category for that. Bedford had no administrative category for it, so they called it sorcery, which was their word for something a human body should not be able to do. Every generation rediscovers Joan of Arc and finds in her whatever that generation needs to find. The French Revolution made her a nationalist symbol. The Catholic Church made her a saint.
The 19th century made her a romantic heroine. The 20th century made her a proto-feminist. The 21st century is still working out what to do with a 19-year-old who was burned alive for wearing men's clothing and winning battles. But underneath all the categories, the historical record is patient and precise. A 17-year-old girl walked out of a village nobody had heard of. She told a discredited king she would crown him. She lifted a siege in 9 days that had resisted 6 months of professional military effort. She won 4 battles in 8 days that reversed 92 years of French military collapse. She brought the king to Rheims. Then she was captured. She was sold. She was burned. And 20 years after they burned her, Charles VII, the king she had crowned, The man she had called the legitimate heir to France, the man who had not ransomed her, finally cleared her name. The victory she bought lasted. France eventually drove the English out, completing by 1453 the final phase of the 100 Years' War that Joan had begun. The English hold on France, which had seemed permanent in 1428, was gone within a generation of her death.
She had bought time. She had bought the possibility of a different future. She had not lived to see it, and the man she saved had not in the end been willing to save her.
What the human body is capable of when it has fully accepted the cost, and what it costs the people who witness that capability to later claim they did not owe the body anything in return, that is the uncomfortable question that the story of Joan of Arc leaves open.
She answered the question of what one person can accomplish alone, against everything. History answered the question of what the people she saved were willing to do for her. Both answers are fully documented. Neither one is easy to sit with.
What do you think of the story of Joan of Arc? Is there another battle or figure from history where one person changed everything against impossible odds? Leave your answer in the comments. We read everyone. Subscribe to Wars and Civilizations and hit the bell. Every week, we bring you the stories history tried to bury, told the way they actually happened. We will see you in the next one.